I wish that Michael Levin were still here, but thank you to both of you so much for letting us witness your discussion. And thank you for coming back on Clubhouse. It's just such a opportunity to hear people speak, Thomas, in a more relaxed and deep manner, especially when you're just discussing these things with someone else, another brilliant mind. So thank you so much for that. I have a couple questions related in some extent to what you were talking about today that'll help me. And then I just want to acknowledge my friend Wissam Reed, who's in the audience, in our ongoing considerations of your work. There was a comment at one point in the room, very briefly, about metaphor. And my question is basically along the lines, I'm sorry, he's not here, to some extent, and there are very different approaches to having field theories of consciousness. To a certain extent, I would say Levin's there. Someone like McFadden is very different with that. But metaphor really brought it to my mind also. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it was Searle who said something, to paraphrase him, along the lines of maybe the reason of a field to describe consciousness, maybe the reason that metaphor is so good is because it's not just a metaphor, it's really what it is. And I wonder, my first question is really, what merit do you think field theories, and whatever stripe you choose to discuss, field theories of consciousness may have merit? What work do you think is worth looking at in that regard, and anything else you'd like to say related to that on, unity of consciousness, for instance, Nagel's discussion and so forth. Some of us will take your response very seriously as we move forward with our study of some of these things. So that's my first question. I have three.
Have you ever heard the name Aaron Gurevich? This was
not.
One famous classical phenomenologist who explored the version of the idea of a field. To me, that has always been very intuitive, because also in my meditation practice, I find something that has a field quality, and that this is very intuitive to me. The deeper question is, of course, if a theory of X has to give us the feeling that now I have understood this, this is intuitively sound to me. And one problem with consciousness is, you see, for quantum mechanics or physics, nobody poses that demand. It should be somehow intuitive or resonate with my own experience. If there are people who are talking about 11 dimensions and strings and things I will never understand, everybody thinks these physicists, they are smart people, they will be knowing what they talk about. And it's completely unintuitive and hard to understand for a normal person, but that's fine. They're physicists. But in the consciousness community, everybody says, if this doesn't feel right to me, and this must be a bad theory of consciousness. Almost all of the audience, me included, has this feeling of, yeah, but it should resonate with my own experience somehow. And then somebody says field theory, and then you have this intuition, yeah, that just there's something about it that is right. And actually, if I had to take a really sober theory of science perspective on all of it, it's just not a criterion for a theory, if it is good or bad. If I find it intuitive or resonating with my own experience, it's really predictive success and parsimony and these criteria for good theory. So I think it would really be possible that we arrive at a theory of consciousness in the future that is satisfactory to scientists, and where everybody says, oh, this is that's disappointing. I didn't understand this. Or is this all it is? I don't believe it. This could happen, actually. And I think maybe in the consciousness community, we have to let go of this need, this emotional need, which I also have, that this somehow should sound true, that it somehow should fit well with everything I seem to know about my own consciousness. Maybe we'll have a counterintuitive theory in the end. That's at least a possibility. But I like fields. Yeah. Second question.
Yeah. So and I agree with all your reasons to pause and consider this. So keeping in mind what we just said, the second question was that I believe, if I was hearing your intention correctly, at one point, and it didn't get picked up very much, you said something to Levin about, and let me just say, if you didn't say this, I would be saying it anyway, but you said something about how our perspective, our own phenomenology, affects how we see things. Now, let me try to be clear what I'm trying to get at. What I've been feeling more the last couple of years is that so much of science acknowledges a first person doing the science, for instance, and it acknowledges the kind of third person or even the kind of view from nowhere approach that science is taking. And it looks to make everything fit those perspectives. But once now to delve a little bit into things you didn't discuss today, but that you discuss at length other places, once a zero-person perspective has actually been, phenomenologically touched. I want to avoid saying like, I have that. But once that is known, again, even saying firsthand gets a little bit weird.
Yes.
It becomes really, as someone who has that myself and who has training in science, it really starts to seem to me that problem of perspectives is so fundamental to not to how to move ahead in science, but how to frame anything, including and maybe even especially how are we going to have an explanation, not just a description of consciousness? And if you could speak to this problem of perspectives in pursuing what I'll loosely call knowledge, I think you probably get what I'm getting at. So that's my second question.
So as you may probably know, I have always been interested in the question if aperspectival conscious experience is possible and what would that mean. But to take a very sober analytical philosopher start where I would begin is, so there's this claim, this very popular claim, the first person perspective is irreducible. And then there's also this claim there are first person data, which I think is false, because data is something that is generated with measuring devices, which can be calibrated and where we have a theory of measuring. But it's somehow, for a large part of the audience, it's very intuitive and kind of woke to say there are first person data and we have to take them, into account. But if one just steps back and says, we have this word, a first person perspective. I mean, what does that mean? It has a first component, first person. That comes from a discipline we might call grammar theory. There is self-reference. For instance, you can refer to yourself using the first person pronoun I. That would be first person reference. There are maybe some analytical subtleties around it, but that's not a mystery. The second part of the word, perspective, comes from a completely different discipline, namely from geometry. I don't know much about geometry, but geometry tells us, for instance, about centered spaces and perspectival spaces and stuff like this. And of course, the very interesting thing that's almost always overlooked is that for animals like us, vision is the then dominant modality. Our visual model of reality is the most salient part of our model of reality. And it is perspectival. It is centered on a point behind the eyes. So if somebody says, my first person perspective or something like that, or I will not allow science to reduce my first person perspective or something like this, the mental image you're conjuring up is actually one of your visual perspective, and of your unique geometric of vision. So if one gets about this if one would talk about all this very carefully and perhaps also technically, the question would be, what is a perspective? That's also the question you're asking, I think. And what kind of epistemic perspectives are there? Like, which ways of knowing are there? Propositional with words and sentences, or sub-symbolic with patterns and colors and shapes or something like this. And I think it somehow comes to the question, under what kind of representation, or under how many different kinds of representation can you try to know or predict and control, as Michael would have it, reality. And I mean, you're absolutely right. This is deep water, and we haven't thought about it a lot. And as soon as we use the word perspective, we have this mental image of different people standing around and having different visual perspectives on a chair or a soccer ball or something like this. And we don't really know what we mean. And neither do I. So I would reframe it as, what is an epistemic perspective, and how many kinds of epistemic perspectives are there? And of course, there are people who professionally work on this in epistemology, in philosophy. And I was shocked when I was young and I asked your kind of question to a famous old philosopher for the first time. The man just said, there's no knowledge out of true sentences. Either you have a theory and you have true sentences, and the rest is knowledge, color perception, all this is just appearance. The only thing that counts are truth values and of sentences, and theoretical knowledge, and science is the gold standard. Which, if you think about Michael's work today, or think about phenomenology, just doesn't sound true anymore today. There's so many ones. Sorry for having no answer to your second question.
This is really good. Again, thank you just so much for existing and talking today. So this is all really good. And believe me, your time is not wasted. I'll listen through this many times and consider where to go with it. The third question, in looking at the fact, from what I understand from Ivy, you wished to speak with Levin, and it was like, okay, why would that be, and what do they have in common? This question is about your relationship to computationalism. So obviously, you seem to have a leaning towards computational ideas, even in your first book. And in the first time you were on Clubhouse, you spoke with Friston, and looking at your work, it seems like you have an ongoing relationship with him. You're interested in Levin. In my own very basic thinking about computational theories of consciousness, I think to myself, and feel free to clarify this for me if you wish, we could be taking it that a computational theory of that sort is something that well models whatever consciousness is, or we could be thinking of it that computation is what brings about the effect of consciousness. I haven't been able to become very clear looking at your work where you really stand. Was this even just maybe a shift because neural correlates weren't panning out quickly? I'd really appreciate anything you could do to clarify your thinking about this so that we can understand where you stand, and anything else you want to add on this computational question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, really. The question is, what is the most promising level of description if we want to explain or understand that some systems have phenomenal properties or instantiate phenomenal properties? And I have just always thought it must be information processing properties in a broad sense of the term, that will be eventually the level of description on which an explanation will take place, and you will know that there's a very strong intuition many people share that phenomenal properties cannot be reduced to functional properties. Maybe in my own life, I wrote a PhD thesis from 1982 to 1985 about the 9 new models to solve the mind-body problem after World War II. And the one thing that was actually really novel without any historical precursors was a series of 9 papers Hilary Putnam wrote, who founded philosophical functionalism and had this idea that minds could be like Turing machine tables, which would be physically realized in some hardware. And then you had a new way of thinking, functional properties and physical properties that realize them sometimes and give them causal power. So that was the first inspiration to me in my own life. Much later, this connectionist revolution, Andy Clark's 1989 book, Microcognition, and Paul Churchland, with whom I spent a year in San Diego later, this whole neurocomputational perspective. I really had a feeling that is philosophically relevant, and that philosophers should know about this perspective on things. But maybe this is completely misguided. I mean, maybe we will have something that has to do with more physical terms like entropy, or the things Carl thinks about and which are much too difficult for me because I cannot grasp it. I'm not intelligent enough, but maybe the right level of description is more on the boundary between statistical physics or information theory or something like this. The question is, what would explain the emergence of phenomenal states? So if that was behind your question, I'm certainly not ideologically, I think, wedded, you say in English, to the computational level of description, but I still think it has enormous potential. This whole idea of the right kind of information flow and the way how this flow becomes nested into itself. And I see this in Michael's work, although if one wanted to be, say, super critical on a conceptual level, of course, there are some conceptual stumbling blocks. But this whole project of seeing the same progress, the same process among many scales, this is really an eye-opener, I think, very simply because these people describe empirical phenomena which most people in the humanities or in philosophy of mind don't know about. I mean, most of my colleagues, yeah, they will understand what a neural network is by now, with a 30-year delay. And they may pick up a little predictive processing talk because they begin to sense that's where it is now, free energy principle. But this adds, I think, a lot of facts people should in the humanities should know. A lot of mysterious facts that you can cut off a salamander's tail and surgically fix it to, the side of its body, and it will gradually transform into a leg. I mean, these are empirical facts philosophers should know about, and I don't know any who know about this. I think these are theoretically relevant facts. Whether this has to be explained on a computational level of description and what that level of description will be in the end, I don't know. I just don't know.
So Thomas, do you take computationalism being true? I just wonder.
What would it mean that computationalism is true? That
Because,
for consciousness, you mean? That
yes.
That phenomenal properties are, you see, yeah, that's easy to say. If the question is, are phenomenal properties ultimately computational properties? It's easy for me to say yes, because I don't have to say what kind of computation, because computation is such a large umbrella term. But what in the course of my academic career I have seen, many people say, for instance, it's fashionable among young people to say, representationalism is dead. And to give you an example, Francisco Varela once invited Dave Chalmers and myself to give talks in Paris to him. And then I told him my self-model story, and he said, Thomas, you are absolutely right on everything you say, and you're doomed. You will never get anywhere because you're a representationalist. This has nothing to do with representation, and I think he would have also said computation. So many of the young people now have these fancy, in activism, extended mind, this 4 big terms, 4E thing, and think this is somehow sexy. But I think the representationalist level of description and the functionalist level of description are still capable of, accommodating new differentiations. They have shown this. I mean, just think about, for instance, Carl and the free energy principle and the concept of a generative model there. That's not a passive representation or something Cartesian. That's something very embodied and also super fine-grained in the formalism you describe it. So I think the representationalist and functionalist levels of description are not dead. They can still be further developed in the history of philosophy and science. And in that sense, I'm a computationalist for consciousness, because I think these two levels of description will eventually be developed and become more fine-grained in a way that we can actually understand what conscious experience is. That's at least my intuition.
Oh, I'm very happy. And again, thank you so much, Thomas. The kind of ideas that you share are, one of the great beauties of life. So thank you again.
Oh, you're saying too much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I always respect your accuracy and the acumen to stay on that first person perspective and to go deep into that in terms of phenomenology and the language around it, to build a clear language around it. So I always wonder if you ever thought about words like attention, awareness, consciousness, because these are all repeatedly used in different traditions in different ways.
Yes.
But in terms of a young seeker who is coming to this out of no traditions, and he picks up on your language, would you like to share some clarity around these words like attention, like awareness?
Yeah.
Is there
Well,
a
you see,
mental awareness and a non-mental awareness? Things like that. Yeah. Yes, I'm done.
I'll tell you something that made me really think. There is a 1988 seminal collection of papers, Consciousness in Contemporary Science, at Oxford University Press, if I remember correctly. And there was a now deceased, pretty unknown British philosopher, Cathy Wilkes. And she had this paper, Yishi, Doom, and Consciousness, and made the simple point that 90%, more than 90% of the languages, the linguistic communities that exist on the planet do not have a word for consciousness and have not seen the necessity to coin a word for consciousness, and said the idea is maybe it was something that happened just in the West, in Europe, as she said, after the Cartesian catastrophe 350 years ago, that some Western theoreticians had this concept of consciousness and then began to make theories about it. And that I find this, we have this, you may have seen, we have this Pure Awareness Research Project, mpe-project.info, I have founded. There's also, by the way, a prize I have created, the Computational Phenomenology of Pure Awareness Prize. The jury is right now brooding over 14 very good submissions. The thing is, we have this survey out you can find on the website where meditators can describe their experience of pure awareness in 7 languages. And you cannot believe how difficult it is to translate this survey, especially, for instance, into Chinese, where many people that have helped with this said, no, I give up on this. This is all different in Chinese. If you would want to translate a word like awareness or consciousness or attention into these very different languages, you already begin to realize that different cultures have very different ways of referring to all of this, also for centuries. And that it's not easy. And that is why I find it very inspiring and important if somebody like Carl Friston comes around and says, well, in this technical framework, it could be precision management or optimization of precision expectations or precision control. That gives me a new perspective on attention, even in meditation. So I think there are basically 3 kinds of agency fundamental for human beings. We can act with our body. There is motor control and motor agency. We can sometimes act, I call this cognitive agency, with conceptual thought, really think about it. But then really important and underrated is attentional agency. There is, if you remember to bring the breath, your attention back to the breath, there's a more or less subtle quality of effort. It's a kind of inner action. Or in shamatha, try to hold your attention on a perceptual object. And I find all of this very interesting. I have in the book, The Elephant and the Blind, which you probably have seen, there is one wonderful young German Zen master who says she tries to direct attention not to some object, but to what is called a mind itself. wakefulness itself. It's one experiential report, and she says it's like folding attention back into itself, like attending to attending, or meta attention, but not as the words may suggest, that is two boxes or to a hierarchy or something. I think there is really a kind of conscious state in which attention or mindfulness can be reflexively mapped back onto itself. And that is something I find very interesting. That is something of which I have the sense it would be important to understand. And this quality, and it's a subtle quality, of attention dynamically folding back into itself, which can sometimes, if the Tibetan Buddhists we just talked about are right, it is not something you can do. It is not something you can construct. It is something you can recognize. And if this Tibetan master of 1243, who wrote this Song of the Seven Introductions, which I also quote in the Elephant Book, is right, just leaving the pure awareness alone and not doing anything with it, it will begin to see itself after a certain time. It's not something the meditator has something to do with it. Sometimes this silent, attentive state will begin to fold back into itself. I do not claim to understand this or be able to give a fancy theoretical explanation of it. But where I'm at now, I think that is maybe of the highest relevance, to understand that this self-knowing quality, but non-egoic, without somebody doing it. The self-knowing quality that can sometimes be in attention. I don't know if this is of any interest to you, but it looks to me currently that this is maybe the most interesting thing, and it may also be very close to what we have to understand if we want to understand what consciousness really is. This may be an essence of conscious experience, actually.
Thank you for joining us, Thomas. I hope you really enjoyed today's conversation with Michael and the group here.
And your questions too.
See
Thanks
you
for
soon.
all the effort and hard work you're putting into this. Let's hope it's beneficial for someone.
Yes, and hope it goes somewhere. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.